The air conditioning in the car had stopped working 3 miles back, and sweat was already pooling at the base of my spine, as my father's Buick cut through the August heat like a knife through warm butter. I was 14 years old, and I had just finished telling him about my plan to try out for the freshman basketball team in September. He had listened, which wasn't unusual. He usually listened when I talked about things that mattered to me, even if his responses came delayed, like his mind was always halfway somewhere else. What was unusual was the way he glanced at his watch, then at my uncle in the passenger seat, and something passed between them that I didn't have a name for yet. Something that felt like a shared joke I wasn't part of. "Pull over here," my uncle said, and my father did, guiding the car into a rest stop that looked like it had been abandoned sometime during the previous decade. The building was low and squat, its windows dark, the parking lot cracked and patchy with weeds pushing through the asphalt. A single picnic table sat under a rusted overhang, and 3 vending machines stood sentinel near the entrance, their glass fogged. "Stretch your legs," my father said, and I opened the door because I trusted him, because I was 14 and you still trust your father when he tells you to do something simple like stretch your legs at a rest stop. I stepped out and the heat hit me like a physical wall, the kind that makes your skin feel tight and your lungs work harder. I turned back to grab the door, thinking I would close it and wait for them to pull forward to the actual parking spots near the building. But the door stayed open, and the engine revved, and the car lurched forward, and my father was looking straight ahead through the windshield like I wasn't even there. I watched the Buick accelerate down the exit ramp, and I remember the exact moment I understood what was happening. My stomach dropped through the floor, my hands went numb, and the world tilted sideways like everything I knew about my life had just been rearranged by careless hands. I stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably only 3 minutes, staring at the taillights disappearing onto the highway, my feet rooted to the asphalt like the heat had melted them in place. The sun was merciless, that white-hot afternoon sun that makes everything look overexposed and too real, and I could feel the sweat running down my sides in steady streams now, soaking into my shirt. I was wearing flip-flops because it was summer, because I hadn't expected to need real shoes, because this was supposed to be a quick trip to visit my grandmother 2 hours away. I had my wallet in my pocket with $11 and my learner's permit, and I had my phone, which was at 40% battery because I had forgotten to charge it the night before. Those were my only resources. Those were all I had. I pulled out my phone and called my father's number, and it rang 4 times before he answered, and when he did, he was laughing. I could hear my uncle laughing in the background, that kind of wheezy laugh that old men do when they think they've really gotten someone, and my father said, "You're supposed to say you've learned your lesson now," and I said, "What?" and he laughed harder and hung up. I called again and it went straight to voicemail. I called again and it rang and rang and rang, and then the automated voice told me the call couldn't be completed as dialed, which meant my father had blocked my number. My uncle's number was already blocked, had been blocked before we even left the house, I realized later. He never even gave me a chance to reach him first. I sat down on the curb because my legs had started to shake and I didn't want to fall, and I pressed my palms against the hot concrete and tried to think of what to do, but my brain had turned to static, the kind of white noise you get when a television loses its signal. The rest stop was completely empty, which was both a blessing and a curse. No one to help me, but also no one to watch me fall apart. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes before I started walking toward the building, thinking maybe there was someone inside, maybe there was a phone I could use, maybe there was an adult who could tell me this was all some elaborate misunderstanding that would be sorted out in the next 10 minutes. The door to the building was padlocked with a chain wrapped through the handles, and the padlock was rusted shut, and the windows were so grimy I couldn't even see inside to confirm whether there was anything in there at all. The vending machines hummed with that low electrical drone that machines make when they're running but not serving anyone, and I approached the closest one and pressed my face against the glass, and saw rows of off-brand sodas and bags of chips that looked like they'd been sitting there since the Clinton administration. I didn't have any coins. My $11 was in bills, but I punched the buttons anyway, knowing nothing would happen, needing to do something with my hands because if I stood still much longer I was going to start screaming. The machine did nothing, of course, and I stepped back and looked at the parking lot, the long empty stretch of cracked asphalt that seemed to stretch forever in both directions, and I understood with a sickening clarity that I was alone. Truly, completely, absolutely alone. My grandmother's number was saved in my phone, but when I called it, my grandmother answered in her slow, careful way, the way she spoke to everyone like she was perpetually translating from a language she only partially understood. She lived in a town called Willow Creek, and she had given me directions to her house 100 times, but I had never needed to use them because my father always drove. I tried to explain what happened, but the words kept getting tangled in my throat, and she kept asking me to repeat myself, and by the time I got the whole story out, she was asking me to stay on the line while she figured out what to do, and I could hear her calling for my grandfather in the background, and the call dropped. My phone had hit 15% battery, and signal out here was weak at best, coming in and going out like a tide that didn't follow any predictable schedule. I sent a text to my mother, who lived 4 hours away and who I saw every other weekend, and I told her what happened in the shortest version I could manage. Dad left me at a rest stop. I don't know where I am. Please call me. The message showed as delivered but not read, and I knew she was at work, knew she wouldn't see it for another 2 hours minimum, and I tried not to think about what that meant. I tried not to think about the fact that my father had planned this, had coordinated it with his brother, had timed it perfectly so that I would be stranded in the hottest part of the day with no resources and no way to reach anyone, and that he was probably sitting somewhere right now telling the story to anyone who would listen, making himself the hero of a joke that had me at its center. I tried not to think about the fact that he had blocked my number, which meant he knew how much this would hurt, which meant he had done it anyway, which meant he had decided that his entertainment was worth more than my safety. There was a tree line maybe 200 yards from the rest stop, and I walked toward it because I didn't know what else to do, because standing still was making the panic worse, because at least walking meant I was doing something even if that something was aimless and desperate. The trees were scraggly and thin, the kind of trees that grow in poor soil and never quite reach their full height, but they provided a sliver of shade that felt like a gift, and I stood under the largest one and tried to catch my breath. My chest felt tight, that specific tightness that comes when you're trying not to cry but your body is fighting you, and I pressed my hand against my sternum like I could physically hold the feeling in place. A car passed on the highway, and I stepped out from under the tree and waved, but the car didn't slow down, just flew past in a blur of color and speed, and the driver didn't even turn their head. I waved at 3 more cars after that, and none of them stopped, and I realized that this was what my father had bet on, that I would be here, alone, desperate, and that no one would help me, that the world would prove him right about how easy it was to abandon a 14-year-old and watch him figure it out. If you've ever been there, stranded somewhere with no one coming, you know exactly what I mean. That specific kind of helplessness that settles into your bones and makes you doubt everything you thought you knew about the people who were supposed to love you. The sun moved across the sky like it always does, indifferent to my situation, and I tried to walk along the highway shoulder, but the heat coming off the asphalt was unbearable, the kind that burns through the soles of flip-flops and makes you feel like you're walking on a griddle. I found a ditch with some water in it, not clean water, just the kind that collects after rain and sits there getting stagnant, and I soaked my shirt in it and put it back on, and the relief was brief but real, and I stood there wringing out the shirt over and over again like it was the only thing keeping me alive. My phone hit 10% and I turned it to airplane mode to conserve what was left, and I sat down in the ditch and stared at the sky and tried to figure out what the plan was, what the actual next step could be, because calling wasn't an option anymore and walking wasn't getting me anywhere, and I was starting to feel like a character in a story where the ending was already written. A trucker would come eventually, I told myself. Someone would stop eventually. Someone always stops eventually, except when someone doesn't, except when you're the kid that your own father bet on, the kid he wagered would fail and prove something about the world that he wanted to be true. The first truck did stop. It pulled off the road about 50 yards from where I was standing, and the driver door opened and a man stepped out, and he was big, the kind of big that could have been from work or from just being alive long enough to accumulate weight everywhere, and he had a beard that was more grey than brown and a cap that said "World's Kayest Grandpa," and he walked toward me with his hands in his pockets, casual, like he was just checking to make sure I wasn't a burglar casing the area. He asked if I was okay, and the word came out of my mouth before I could stop it. Yes. I said yes because I had been trained to say yes, because strangers ask if you're okay and you say yes even when you're not, even when the answer is so far from yes that it's almost funny. He looked at me for a long moment, that specific kind of look that older people give when they're deciding whether to believe you or not, and he asked where my parents were, and I opened my mouth to lie and couldn't make the lie come out, and I said, "My dad left me here as a joke." The words sounded insane even to me, and the man frowned and said, "What do you mean he left you here?" And I said, "He drove away with my uncle, he blocked my number." The man stood there for a second, and I could see him processing it, could see the disbelief and then the anger and then the something else, something that looked like it might have been pity, but was probably just the recognition that the world was full of people who did things that didn't make sense. He told me to get in the truck. He didn't ask me to explain further or prove anything or call anyone to verify my story. He just said get in, and I got in, and the air conditioning was blasting so cold it felt like ice on my sunburned skin, and I almost cried from the relief of it. And the man got in the driver's side and said his name was Harold and he was headed to a town called Miller's Crossing, which was about 40 miles from where my grandmother lived, and he said he could take me there if I knew the address. I told him my grandmother's address, and he put it in his GPS, and we pulled back onto the highway, and I watched the rest stop shrink in the side mirror until it disappeared, and I didn't look back after that. Harold didn't ask me a lot of questions, which I was grateful for, but he did ask me once if my dad was the kind of person who did things like this. And I said no, I didn't think so, and then I said I wasn't sure anymore, and Harold nodded like that was a reasonable answer, like he understood that the answer to that question could change in an instant depending on which version of your father you were looking at. He offered me a bottle of water from the cooler in the back seat, and I drank it so fast I nearly choked, and he told me to slow down, that there was more where that came from. And I wanted to tell him that no one had ever told me to slow down on anything before, not like he meant it, not like he actually cared whether I choked or not, but I didn't know how to say that without sounding like I was asking for something. So I just nodded and drank slower and watched the trees blur past the window. We stopped at a gas station about 20 miles from Miller's Crossing so Harold could get coffee, and he asked if I wanted anything, and I said no because I didn't want to take his money, didn't want to be more of a burden than I already was, and he came back with a gas station hot dog and a bag of chips and a Gatorade, and set them on the dashboard in front of me and said, "Eat." I ate, and it was the best hot dog I had ever tasted in my life, and I remember thinking that if this was what kindness tasted like, then I had been starving for a long time without knowing it. Harold called my grandmother on his phone and explained the situation to her, and she was crying by the time he hung up, and I could hear her crying through the phone even though I wasn't the one holding it, could hear the way grief and relief can sound exactly the same when they hit you all at once. He drove me the rest of the way in silence, the good kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words because the words are what's important. And when we pulled up to my grandmother's house, she was standing on the porch with her hands pressed against her mouth, and she was crying again, and she ran to the truck before Harold had even fully stopped, and she opened my door and pulled me into her arms and held me so tight I could feel her heartbeat against my chest. My father called about an hour later. My grandmother had already called him, had already screamed at him in that quiet, controlled way she had, the way that was somehow worse than screaming, and he had probably been sitting in his car or somewhere trying to figure out what to say. Why, probably waiting to see if his joke had worked if I had failed the test he had designed for me. I didn't answer. I let it ring and ring and ring while my grandmother stood in the doorway watching me, and then he texted, and the text said, "You're supposed to call me and say you learned your lesson." That was it. That was the whole message. No apology, no explanation, no asking if I was okay, just instructions on how to complete the joke. I showed the text to my grandmother, and she took my phone and called my mother, and my mother left work early and drove 4 hours to come get me. And when she arrived, she didn't say much, just held me in the kitchen while my grandmother made tea, and I could feel her shaking, could feel the anger that was barely contained in her shoulders and her jaw, and I knew that something was going to change, that this was one of those moments that splits your life into before and after. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and meetings and people asking me questions I didn't want to answer. My mother filed a report. Not pressing charges, she said, just creating a record, just making sure there was documentation in case something happened again, in case next time wasn't a rest stop with a kind trucker who stopped, in case next time was something worse. My father didn't understand why she was making such a big deal out of it. He called and said it was just a joke, said I needed to learn to take a joke, said I was being too sensitive and too dramatic and too much like my mother, and I wanted to tell him that I had walked 4 miles in the August heat with no water and no shoes and no plan, wanted to tell him that I had sat in a ditch soaking my shirt in stagnant water to keep myself alive, wanted to tell him that I had believed, even for a moment, that I might actually die out there, but I didn't. Because he wasn't asking, he was telling, and there was a difference, a massive difference. The difference between someone who wants to understand and someone who just wants you to agree with them. This part still makes me pause when I think about it. The way he could look at what happened and see a joke, see a lesson, see anything other than his son alone and terrified and bargaining with the universe to send someone, anyone, to help him. The weeks that followed were strange in the way that post-trauma things are strange. I couldn't sleep without the light on. I couldn't be in a car without checking the exit route. I flinched when my father raised his voice, even when it wasn't directed at me, even when he was just talking on the phone. The sound of anger in his voice triggered something deep in my chest that felt like panic, like the memory of standing at that rest stop and watching his taillights disappear. I started seeing a counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Ellison, who never pushed me to talk about what happened but always left space for me to do it if I wanted to. I didn't want to at first. I wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, wanted to file it away in the part of my brain where things go that I'm not ready to deal with. But Dr. Ellison had a way of sitting with me in the silence that made the silence feel safe, like it wasn't empty, like it was full of something that just needed time to become words. My parents split up that fall, not because of the rest stop, my mother said, but because of a lot of things that had been building for years, and the rest stop was just the moment that made her realize she didn't want to spend the rest of her life hoping someone would change. I went to live with her full time, and my father got every other weekend, which didn't feel like enough and also felt like too much. Like I wanted to see him and also never wanted to see him again. Like I loved him and also didn't recognize him anymore. Like he had showed me a version of himself that I couldn't unsee no matter how hard I tried. He tried to talk about it once, just one time, and he said he was sorry if I felt like he had done something wrong, and I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him. Wanted to scream that if I felt was not an apology, that if I felt was him protecting himself from having to actually admit anything, but I didn't because I was 14 and he was my father and I still needed him to be someone I could look up to even though I was learning that he wasn't. Even though I was learning that the person I had thought he was had probably never existed at all. The twist when it came 6 months later. I was at my father's apartment on a Sunday afternoon doing homework at the kitchen table while he watched television in the next room and his phone buzzed with a text message. He was in the bathroom and I know I shouldn't have looked, but I looked because I was 14 and curiosity was louder than conscience, and the text was from his brother, my uncle, and it said, "The bet was $200, you owe me." That's when I understood. Not a jog. Not a lesson, not even a test. A bet, a wager. My father had gotten in his car with his brother and driven to that rest stop and looked at his 14-year-old son and placed a bet on whether that son would survive the afternoon, and he had lost the bet, which meant I had survived, which meant I had been worth $200 to him, which meant that somewhere in the universe there was a ledger where my life was balanced against a sum of money, and the number was small enough to be funny. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream or cry or throw anything, even though all of those things were clawing at my chest like animals trying to get out. I just closed the phone and went back to my homework and sat there staring at the same problem for 20 minutes without seeing any of it, my brain too full of something that felt like grief but was actually just the final piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was assembling. He was never the person I thought he was. I had built a version of my father in my mind that loved me unconditionally, that would always come back for me, that was safe, and the joke, the test, the bet, whatever he wanted to call it, had been the hammer that broke that version into 1,000 pieces, and I was sitting in the wreckage trying to figure out which pieces were still real. The years that followed were hard in the way that rebuilding yourself is hard. I learned to be careful with my heart, learned to not give it to people who hadn't earned it, learned that love was not a guarantee of safety and family was not a promise of protection. My mother remarried when I was 16, a quiet man named David who never raised his voice and always asked how my day was and meant it. And I watched her with him and felt something that might have been hope, might have been the beginning of believing that people could actually be what they appeared to be. My father stayed the same. He called every week and came every other weekend and never brought up what happened, never apologized, never acknowledged that anything had changed. And I think that was the hardest part. The way he just continued as if nothing had shifted, as if I was supposed to do the same, as if the relationship between us could just pick up where it left off without anyone having to address the crater that had opened up between us. I'm 23 now. I've told this story maybe a dozen times in my life to friends and therapists and one woman I dated for 2 years who eventually decided she couldn't handle the weight of it. And every time I tell it, something new comes loose. Some splinter I didn't know was still embedded in there, some piece of grief that was waiting for the right moment to surface. I don't hate my father. I tried to for a while because hate felt cleaner than the complicated thing I actually felt, but hate requires energy I don't have. And the complicated thing, the thing that is equal parts love and grief and betrayal and longing, that thing is what I have to live with, so I've learned to carry it. My grandmother passed away 3 years ago, and at her funeral I saw my father for the first time in months, and he looked older, looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. And when he hugged me I could feel how thin he had gotten, how the years had worn him down in ways he never talked about, and I almost felt sorry for him, almost, except sorry isn't the right word either because sorry suggests he had no control, and he always had control. He just chose to use it in ways that destroyed things instead of building them. The line I keep coming back to, the line that won't leave me alone, is this. I thought a parent's love was supposed to be the one thing I could count on to be real, and it turned out to be the thing I had to learn to live without. That's not a complaint or a plea for sympathy. It's just the truth of what happened, the truth of what I learned, the truth of what it cost me to understand that the people who are supposed to protect you can be the ones who put you in danger, and that the wound doesn't heal just because you want it to. Just because time passes, just because you're supposed to get over things and move on and not let the past control your present. Some wounds just become part of you, become the thing you carry, become the thing that shapes how you move through the world and who you let in and how hard you hold on when someone shows you the smallest sign that they might be safe. The bet was $200. He paid his brother the next day. My life, my fear, my walk through the August heat, my night in a stranger's truck, my months of counseling, my broken trust, my slowly rebuilt sense of safety, all of it balanced against a sum of money that probably bought his brother dinner and a six-pack of beer. That's the math he did, that's the equation he solved, and I am what it equals.